So there was a famous professor who said that he learned 3 things never to discuss with other people, especially if you don't want to have an argument. That famous professor said, never discuss religion, politics, or the great pumpkin. I promise you today, I will not be speaking about the great pumpkin. That is because I don't like pumpkins or orange vegetables for that matter. But for me, it's not politics. For me, it's religion. What is the Torah's point of view on contemporary issues, things that are happening around us? And as Jews, we are always interested to know what is the Torah, the Jewish opinion about these subjects. Let me begin with a story of why I am standing here in front of you. My father was born in 1933, which makes him one of the youngest survivors of Auschwitz concentration camp. When he survived in 1945, he went home, and his bar mitzvah was in 1946. He lost his father, most of his family. His sister and mother survived, and he was trained for his bar mitzvah by one uncle who survived and had his bar mitzvah. And then when Czechoslovakia was becoming communist, I think it was the chief rabbi of England, asked the government, what do you need all of these orphans running around your town? They're a strain on your economy. You have to waste your resources on them. Let them come here to England. So my grandmother sent my aunt and my father before 1948, before it became communist, and they sent them to study in England. My father studied in the yeshiva in England for 2 years. And he was a good, bright student, and he wanted to attend what was then, in his mind, considered the best yeshiva in the world, or the largest yeshiva in the world, and that was in Lakewood, New Jersey, Yeshiva Gavoa. He didn't grow up to be a chassid, and he wasn't fond of Hasidic philosophy. And his hope was that he would go to Lakewood. So he traveled from England to Canada. That was easy. You didn't need a visa back then. Why? It all belonged to the Queen. But then he did not get a visa to the United States. They wouldn't let him into the United States. So he was forced to go to the only yeshiva that was in Montreal, Canada, and that was the Lubavitch Yeshiva. And he made a condition with them that he would like to learn here, but he doesn't want to touch Hasidic philosophy. And after consulting with the Rabbi, they said, fine. Now just imagine that. You go into a yeshiva today and you say, I'd like to study everything besides Talmud or Code of Jewish Law. But they allowed my father. I guess if you don't force somebody to do something, eventually he will do it on his own. He only became an American citizen when he married my mother, and that was 12 years later. So, if the United States government would have allowed my father into the States, I wouldn't be speaking to you here today. You would have to come hear me at the Discovery seminar put on by Aish. But because the United States government did not give my father a visa, that's why I am a Chabadnik today. Okay? So the question is that justified? Was the United States government correct in refusing my father's visa? Not only United States. We can ask that question regarding every country. Do they have a right to close their borders and to decide who, when, where, and how many they're going to allow into their country at any given time? That is the question. Now, we know that our Constitution allows the government and gives the government the right to decide who and when and how many can enter into the country. However, what does Torah say? And there are many who believe that borders is a man-made construct, and really it is unethical, it is immoral. That they argue that the world belongs equally to everybody. We are all children of God, and therefore any one of us has a right to settle and to benefit from any part of the world they choose. So they argue one world. It is just governments who decided to control a certain area of the world, make it their own, reserve it for their citizens, and deprive everybody else from that benefit. And they believe it is wrong because it all belongs to all of us. Then there is the moral justice, equality, equity argument, that why would you deprive people from third world countries from having a better life, having the opportunities that the countries that they choose has to offer to them. So they make the argument, yes, even if the world is carved up into different territories, but we should be compassionate if we believe in equity and justice. We should allow anybody to benefit, anybody to come to work. Another argument is that it helps diversity. Allowing people into your country from different cultures ultimately helps you. We wouldn't have Chinese restaurants if we wouldn't have immigrants from China. We wouldn't have French restaurants. We wouldn't have Italian restaurants. So if you want diversity of tastes and flavors and music and art, we are better off. And the last is the economic benefit, that it would help your own country, or it would help those refugees. So this is the argument that you would hear all the time when you listen to the news of those who argue to have a lax border policy or to treat all human beings as equal, allowing them to benefit from the resources of any country they choose. They believe just as it is wrong for a dictator to seal the borders, making sure that nobody exits, it is just as wrong to seal the borders to guarantee that nobody has entry. So the question is that we are going to ask, again from the Torah Jewish perspective, do governments have a legal right to close their border and or limit immigration? And then what would the Torah say about this argument, one world, open borders argument, that it belongs to all of us? The analogy would be like here in the United States. Anybody can choose to live anywhere. Once you're a citizen of this country, you can go to any part of the United States. You need no visa. There is no restriction of where you can settle, open up a business, and live with your family. So they believe that it's one world, one nation. So the question is, what does Torah say? So let's begin our journey together. You have your readings in front of you, which I will not read. I might make reference to, but feel free to read it as we go along, or take it home to look at it back then. Look at it when you get home. So where does the Torah address this? So the first part of our discussion is going to be the famous story in Genesis of Migdal Bavel, the Tower of Babel. The Torah tells us that they decided that they were going to build this monument, that they were going to gather all the citizens of the world in order to make a name for themselves so that they can live in one place, in one locality, and they should not be dispersed over the face of the entire world. However, the Torah doesn't tell us why Hashem was so upset. The Torah doesn't tell us why God was so angry that changed all their languages and scattered them around the world. It's a cryptic story, and we have to turn to the commentaries to see what was so upsetting. So, we go back to the story of Genesis. What is the charge that Hashem gives, that God gives Adam and Eve? That you should reproduce and you should multiply and you should fill the earth. So God blessed Adam and Eve, and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So it is not only that you should multiply and have many children, but that you should fill the earth. Nachmanides tells us, what does that mean? That the original intention was that we should inhabit the entire globe. Not only there should be many people, but rather part of developing and cultivating the world, we should benefit and take advantage of all of the areas that Hashem provided for us. So Hashem's original goal was that we are scattered and we are divided into many, many nations. Not all of us to live in one place with one experience. So Maimonides says that God's plan was that we should inhabit the planet and we should cultivate all areas of the world, of the globe, and we should be cultivated by it. Different climates will have different cultures, will have different strengths, will produce different resources. And Hashem wants that we should spread out as far as possible. How many nations did God have in mind? That we have to turn to the portion of Hazinu, the song of Hazinu, the third to the last portion of the Torah. Hazinu, we have a very interesting verse. When Most High gave nations their lands, when he divided mankind, he set up the borders of these nations to parallel the number of Israel's descendants. So there we talk about how God intentionally created different nations, divided them, spread them around the globe. How many nations? 70 nations, corresponding to the 70 Jews who went down to Egypt. So there are 70 general nations that Judaism always talks about. And this was by divine design, corresponding to the 70 Jews. In other words, 70 Jews, and we have the obligation to be a light unto the nation. We have an obligation to influence and affect the 70 parallel nations of the world. So we could only understand what that verse means if we go back to Genesis, and you can only understand Genesis if you go back to this verse, and then you get the full and total picture, which is that, number one, the entire earth should be settled, and it shouldn't be settled by one nation, by one people, but rather nations should develop independently. So then the question is, why? What benefit is there to borders and nationhood? It means if you have nations, you're going to have borders. There's going to be territory. One stops, the others begin. So what is the benefit of having not one human race, but rather different nations, different cultures, and different perspectives on the world? So we will go to the famous prophecy of Bilam, the non-Jewish prophet of Bilam, who sees his Jewish people, and what does he say? Ma tovu, o halecha Yaakov mishkanasecha Yisrael. How goodly are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling's place, O Israel. What was he so impressed? So there are different answers. One answer, that we respected each other's privacy. But what does Rashi say? That Rohr kol shevet v'shevet, he saw each and every tribe, shoichen la'atzmai, that they were dwelling in their respective quarters, and they did not mingle. So what he saw was that we have 12 tribes, and they were situated on different sides of the temple, east, west, north, and south. Each side had 3 tribes, and he was so impressed that you have different tribes living on different sides, and they didn't intermingle. Everybody knew who they belonged to, and everybody knew what their role is. And what's so special, and why is that necessary? Because every tribe has its unique service to God. Every person is unique, and every nation is unique, and every tribe is unique. That each tribe served God differently. Reuven is sight. to make God and Torah real to the point that you can see it with your mind's eye. Shimon was more of hearing. Levi served as the priests and the Levites. Yehuda were the kings. So Hashem set them up, and Bilam said, I like this. It's not one big mishmash, but rather it is individual tribes, each one understanding, appreciating what their role is, and living it out to their fullest. And that is actually the reason of why every 50 years in Israel, all the territories went back to the way it was in Joshua's time. So Israel was divided according to the 12 tribes, and then every 50 years, the Jubilee year, everything went back. In other words, you couldn't buy territory in Israel, you leased territory for how many years, depending on how many years are left to the Jubilee year, to the Yovel. But it had to go back. Now you'll have many different commentators, many different contemporary points of view. But if you look at the classic commentaries, they'll tell you because Hashem wanted that we should have this tribal system. So everybody should remember and know who they belong to. So if everybody's going to purchase land anywhere in Israel, and that will be acceptable, so then what happens? You'll have assimilation, and then 2-3 generations, nobody would know from which tribe they come from, so nobody can exercise their purpose in creation. And that's why it had to return to its original state in 50 years. So what do we see? We see that each tribe served God according to their own nature, their unique soul potential, and Borders today serves God's purpose of creating cultural diversity. So, United States, I live in Dayton, Ohio. If you live on the East Coast, what do you consider Dayton, Ohio? Flyover country, correct? So, in New York, they are persistent, loud. I'm a New Yorker, so I'm allowed to say it. I was originally born in New York, so I can disparage New Yorkers. Tough, rough, and all right, okay. But when we talk about Southern hospitality, that is here. Midwestern warmth. When you come to the Midwest, everybody is nice, and people let you in when you put on your blinker. When you need a parking space, people will stop for you. So you need the aggressiveness of New York, plus you need the Menschlichkeit of Ohio. And every state brings something unique, and I think that this was the genius of our founding fathers, that they understood that different states can develop differently, and that is not necessarily a bad thing. As we could see from Torah, the Torah considers that the ideal. In other words, we can respect differences. We must respect and admire and benefit from. That means there's no country in the world that has all resources that can manage on their own. Hashem spread it out so that we can cooperate and we are dependent upon each other to create this best possible world. The next issue is border security. That Torah tells us that not only are you allowed to have borders, but you're allowed to have secure borders, and you must have borders to protect you from invaders and for enemies. You see that from when they established the land of Israel and divided it amongst the 12 tribes. Moses placed on the top Naphtali and Asher. These were considered the strongest warriors, and it was their responsibility, as the verse tells us, your bolts shall be of iron and copper. And what does Rashi tell us? Meaning that you are going to keep our gates sealed and closed. Most of the tragedies in Israel came from the north. So who did Moses place on the north? He placed who did Joshua place? Asher and Naphtali, that they were responsible of the safety of the entire land. So not only are you allowed to have borders, but you can secure your borders and protect your borders. national sovereignty. Torah respects and acknowledges and maybe even values national sovereignty. So where do we see that? Now, you can make an argument that everything that I am telling you is self-serving. That what is my goal? My goal is to defend the land of Israel. Or as an American, to defend the United States. So all of these proof texts that I'm bringing you from the Torah, that the Torah tells us that God gave us Israel, it is our inheritance, our land, that we have a right to protect it, live in security. You can tell me that's fine for Jews. However, we find in the Torah that Hashem gifted other nations land and territory just like he gave us. And Hashem told us that we must respect their boundaries. Where do we see it? We see it from Edom. The Torah tells us that just as God gave us the land of Israel, he gave Edom. Edom are the descendants of Esau. And he gave them a plot of land as well, which would be Jordan, Syria. That's the area that we are talking about. And God tells the Jewish people, you should know that I gave this to them, and that's not yours. And the same thing God gave to Lot's children, Ammon and Moab. God gave them as well 2 territories on the east side of the Jordan, and God clearly tells us, I gave it to them. They're off limits to you. It is not yours. So what happens? Jews have to enter the land of Israel. You can see where they were. They are in the Sinai desert after receiving the Torah, and then they have to enter the land of Israel. What would be the quickest route if you're in the Sinai desert? The quickest route would be to go alongside the east border of Israel and go above the Dead Sea right into Israel. Only one problem. Who is living there? Edom is living there. And God told us, you cannot pass Edom's territory. So what does Moses do? Moses sends a delegation, and he requests the permission of Edom to travel through their territory. And he's quite diplomatic. He says, after all, we're brothers. Jacob and Esau, we're brothers. You know all of our suffering that we had to experience in Egypt. And you know, God promised Abraham and Isaac that their children will be enslaved. We were the one who took that upon ourselves. So at least help us now when we have to enter into our homeland. Edom says no. So what does Moshe say? Okay, if I cannot appeal to your sense of family and brotherhood, let's see if I can bribe you with money. And what does he say? We are going to travel only on the king's path. We won't use any of our provisions, although they had the water, the manna. We won't use any of our resources. We will stay in your hotels. We will eat from your restaurants. We will drink from your bars. Just allow us to pass. What does Edom say? Nope. Edom says, I will not allow you to pass. Why not? Some suggest because they were petrified. They said, yeah, this is just an opening, but we know what you guys did to Egypt. So they said no. How do you think God reacted to that? God says, it's theirs, they have their right. I might not be happy, but they have the right. What did it cause? It caused us that we have to walk around all of Edom and not travel through Edom. So we can see here that it is not only the borders and the boundaries of Israel that Hashem respects and values, but rather of all nations. Of all nations. So, if we have to summarize this, what we can learn, what are the contemporary applications? Number one, we can see that there is a value in individual national identities. Each nation contributes something individually, and that should be celebrated. And we are not looking for an assimilated world where there's only one culture. Cultural diversity is healthy and even necessary. Number 2, national sovereignty must be respected, should be respected. The independence of each nation, as God gave each nation their land, their territory, and that must be respected. Number 3, that borders should be secured against our enemies or invaders. And number 4, permission must be granted to enter. My father couldn't break the law and say, I want to go to Lakewood and therefore I don't care what your laws are. According to Torah, we have an obligation to ask for permission to enter the land, and we have to accept the decision of the country. Now, I am not talking about should they or they shouldn't, how many. That's not part of this discussion. Just the idea. Can a country refuse entry into their lands? According to Torah, the answer would be yes. I am not saying that they should or how open it should be. Just this question itself. Does a government have a right to decide who, what, and when? And is borders a man-made invention, or does it have its origins in the Torah itself? Settling that, at least in my mind, we have to go to the next issue. The next issue is the right of conquest. So God sets up the earth, 70 nations, gives every nation their land, tells them to cultivate it, and to reveal all of its hidden resources. Then the question is, can that ever change? Or there are 70 nations and the original borders must remain the same. Can they change? Do they change? So 2 questions. What would Torah say regarding territory acquired and borders established through war? Do the spoils legally belong to the victor? Or do we consider it theft? That this was given to another nation. These are objects, property that belongs to other people, and therefore it is wrong for you to take them, benefit, and use from it. So now, as you said before, what was the law throughout history? Throughout history, the law was the victor gets the spoils. And we know there were wars throughout history that changed all the boundaries all the time. As the joke goes, you ask somebody in Hungary, where was he born? And he will tell you on the border. Why? Because the border changed every Monday and Thursday. Okay? So, according to international law, which I think that we started talking about international law, or people started listening to it more in the 16th century, 17th century, where they try to get a system of law that everybody can buy in. And that's when you find the first writings about war, rights of conquest, or should there be war, on what basis can there be war, is it ever justified, is it never justified? And then we have the League of Nations, that they got together and they spoke about these issues, and what happened with all of their principles and all of their rules? Out the window. We had World War II, and what happened after World War II? All the boundaries were reshaped, were remolded, redivided, and then what happened? The UN now makes war unacceptable. The only war would be a defensive war, but swapping of land, taking territory in war, any war, even if it's a defensive war, the UN Charter says is unacceptable. Every war, every piece of land and piece of territory must be returned, even if it is a defensive war, which to me personally makes absolutely no sense. I could understand that you shouldn't benefit from an offensive war, but from a defensive war, to me, that is the best deterrent. If a nation goes to war with another nation and they lose their territory, they lose their land, they will think twice. But today, what's the big deal? If I win, I win. If I lose, I still win, because there's no real loss. I will still get whatever I can. Now, we don't find territorial change through war much since 1945, although we have certain pockets of it. The latest one, the most famous one, is Crimea. I guess they're powerful enough, and we just accept it. So they condemned them in the UN Assembly, and then what happened? Nothing happened. Life goes on. Okay. And the same thing is with China. That is also now infringing on other territorial rights and territory of other nations. And what are we doing? We are buying their wicker baskets because we cannot live without it. So we let China off the hook. So the question is, according to Torah, would we consider this theft? Now, it's a very serious question and a religious question. It is not a political question. Where do we see this question come up? In Jewish law, we know that you cannot perform a mitzvah through a sin. The end does not justify the means. I cannot say, I am going to steal, but I'm going to give it to charity. God says, I despise that. Every part of the mitzvah, every object that facilitates the performance of a mitzvah must be gotten honestly. It cannot be through a sin. In other words, I cannot celebrate Pesach with non-kosher food. I cannot have matzah that's not kosher. That would be a sin, and then the mitzvah doesn't count. So the question is, if you have a field that grows lulav, the esrog for sukkahs, and it was confiscated by a king who went to war with a nation, and now it was expropriated, and now the king tells the Jews, you can go use this. Enter the field and benefit from it. Can a Jew benefit from this esrog if it belonged to somebody else before this nation was conquered? The same thing would be shofar. If you have a shofar that comes off of an animal, that was again confiscated. Now, if you want to get a bit more political or controversial, I can give you two other cases. There's one case where you find that there is a Jew that lost his store in war. So there was one nation went to war with its neighbor. This Jew was in the losing side, and his store was confiscated, was expropriated by the victor. The king gave the rights of this business to a fellow Jew. The original Jew comes to rabbinic court and says, that was mine. How can he take it? How did the rabbinic court rule? Interesting. Yesterday, if you read the news out of Israel, Poland changed its law now, and they said, now after 30 years, any land that originally belonged to Jews, they cannot claim anymore. So although this was territory expropriated by the communist regime, but now they declared it ownerless, or they declared it the property of the state, and therefore no Jew can claim it. What would Torah say about that? Get a bit more controversial? How about all of the loot, all the art that was stolen by the Nazis? Who does that belong to today? Okay. These were all questions that were asked by fellow Jews to the rabbinic court. Who has a right to use this? Is it considered theft? Again, Torah wouldn't justify the war. Torah doesn't recommend war. But the question is, now that it happened, what do you do? Who does it belong to? A similar case would be, if you have a thief that steals pillars from someone's home and he places it into their home, are you going to ask the thief now to dismantle his home because he has to return it? So again, Torah doesn't say that you should steal. We know it says just the opposite. However, you have the thief who stole these beams, these pillars, and he used it to uphold his roof. When he repents, do we force him to take it out? So the question that we are asked, not if Torah encourages war, not if it allows war, but rather once it happened, how do we deal with it? So the first issue that we have is, if you remember what I told you the story previously, that God gave the land to other nations to besides Israel. And he gave two nations, Lot's children, Ammon and Moab. So this is where they lived. Ammon and Moab lived right there. And here you had the nation of the Amorites. They were led by Sichon. Oh, that's exactly my question. How did that happen? In other words, if this area was promised to Ammon and Moab, how did it become Jewish territory? Who lived there? Reuven, Gad, the tribe of Manasseh. We saw that God respected the nation's integrity and their sovereignty to the point that we walked around. We had to go around Edom. What happened here? So the Talmud asks that question. And the Talmud tells us that Sichon and his army conquered the land of Ammon and Moab. And they settled that land. So there is a verse in the Torah that seems out of place, where the Torah tells us the history of the wars that took place between the Amorites and Ammon and Moab, Sichon. And the commentaries tell us, why is it necessary to know that bit of history? Torah is a book for Jews. And it here answers that question, tells us the Talmud, that because Sichon conquered this land from Ammon and Moab, then it is not Ammon and Moab's land anymore. They purified it. And now it is free game. Now, once Sichon owns it, it severs the ties of the original nations. What do we see? That territory can change. We find that regarding land, we find out about human beings, and we find out about territory. We find the same thing regard of property. So another interesting story. We are now 700 years, a little over 700 years before the Common Era. Sancherib, the most powerful king, the king of Assyria, is devouring one nation after the other. And he attacks and he defeats the northern tribes of Israel. And now he comes down to Jerusalem. He has 185,000 soldiers surrounding Jerusalem. King Chizkiyahu is worried. He hears from the prophet, and the prophet tells him, "You've got nothing to worry about. God is going to protect you." This is the Seder night, first Seder. Chizkiyahu basically tells God, "This is your problem, not mine. I have a Seder to attend, and I'm going to go to sleep." That night is called Leil Shemurim, the night of protection. And they wake up next morning, and what happens? The enemy is gone. Nobody is there. An angel came and dealt with them. However, all of their loot and all of the property that they have brought with them from neighboring nations is sitting all there right on the outskirts of Jerusalem. And the prophet tells them, Isaiah tells them, go ahead, you can enjoy from it. Go ahead, take whatever you want. They were hesitant. And they said, how can we take it? Some of this is property that belonged to the Jews who they defeated and conquered before they got here. So would that be considered theft? Because originally it was Jewish property. And what does the Talmud tell us? That the prophet basically said it was till the war. Once they were defeated, then it changes hands, it changes ownership, and now it belongs to Sancheriv and his nation, and because they were defeated by God, now it is up to you to enjoy. It is there for you for the taking. So according to Torah, the answer, can you use the shofar? Can you use the lulav? The answer is absolutely, because it is not considered theft, that the Torah recognizes the international norm that existed throughout history. And what was the principle? The spoils belong to the victor. What is the basis? What is the halachic principles? How does that exchange take place? And there are three different principles that different commentators focus on. There can be three different reasons. The first one is yush. So the concept of yush is despair and I give up hope. What does it mean? If somebody lost an object, can I claim it? So we know in American society, or most of the world, what do we say? Finders, keepers, losers, weepers. The Torah says, no, you have an obligation to return it. But at some point, if you cannot find a rightful owner, you can't take possession of it. But what must happen? You have to be sure that the original owner releases his right of ownership. How is that accomplished? When a person says, oh no, I lost this, and I'm going to have to buy a new one. In other words, he gives up hope of ever finding it again. Okay? And that is the concept of yush. So what happens in war? When a superpower ransacks your country and takes all of you as captives and takes all of the possession, what is the average person thinking at that time? Will they get it back? Or is this history? Do they give up? So this is, some of the commentaries say, because that is natural. So the question that you would ask today, when the Jews left Germany, did they ever think that they're going to get any of this property back? Did they ever give up hope? Now, I am not suggesting that we shouldn't fight for what belongs to us. We should. Now let me tell you that my father and his sister tried, but although they say that they can take it back, but they make it so difficult, you have to jump through so many hoops, it is almost impossible to actually reclaim it. But we can use international law to our benefit. So, yes, I absolutely support that we should take them to court and we should gain whatever we can. However, according to Torah, if you ask what happens in Israel in that same situation, for instance, during the 6-Day War, the War of Independence in Israel, when Jews lost territory and Jordan claimed it, if you would go to a rabbi, the rabbi would say, you lost it. They gained it in war, and Torah recognizes acquisition by war. Why? We'll answer questions later. Why? Because of this concept of yush, giving up hope. The other concept is possession, chazaka. The mere fact that they're inhabiting the land, the fact that they are living there, that means that they take possession of it. And we have this principle throughout the Talmud. Chazaka, I make changes to the territory, and that allows it to become mine. The difference is, the question would be, if the nation leaves. If the nation leaves and they're not settled in it anymore, does it still belong to them? The last one is, the law of the land is law. Dina de malchusa dina, which is, translated in this case, international norm. The international norm till 1945 was conqueror's right. That you can acquire, and everybody did acquire land through conquest. According to this, what would we have to say if we rely on this third principle? The law of the land is the law, just like a king can confiscate, just like the king can expropriate property for the benefit, same too can any government. Today, however, This is not the norm anymore. We cannot say that war is accepted today. It is not accepted. Another aspect is Torah obligates us to respect all of the treaties that we signed. So if any country signs the treaty and accepts the UN chapter, the UN charter, they will be obligated to follow that. So if Dina de Malchus Din is only because that is the norm, what happens when the norm changes? And what happens when you agree to follow a certain system? So today, we would have to respect international law. Not suggesting that we should go to war. And the final piece of this puzzle, that when Jews went to war, it was quite difficult. For a Jew to go to war, there are 3 categories of war in Judaism. Some say 2, because the first is part of the same one. Wars of mitzvah, where there is a mitzvah to go to war and to defeat our enemies. That would be the nation of Amalek, the arch enemy, and that would be the 7 nations that live in the land of Israel. That is a war that must happen. A war of obligation, which some say it is the same mitzvah. That is a war of self-defense. We have an obligation to defend ourselves. If our enemies are attacking us, we have an obligation, which is today's Torah portion. The Torah portion that we read today speaks about war and who is exempt from going to war. And when it comes to a war of mitzvah, of a war on obligation, there's no exemption. Everybody has to fight. How about in a permissible war or an authorized war, which we were not being attacked, and it is not part of the 7 nations of the world? It is because we want to expand our territory. So that would be permitted as well. However, we have examples of the first 2 categories, the war of mitzvah. We have the war of obligation, self-defense, many examples of that. And permissible wars, very few. Why? Because the king couldn't, at least to most commentaries, didn't have the right to start a war with a neighbor just because he wanted to flex his muscle. And you have a story, you have a piece of Talmud that talk from Brachot, which tells us about a war that seems to be in the category of permissible. That there was a terrible famine in Israel, that there wasn't enough food. So David decides that what is he going to do? He's going to deal with the nation of Aram, which is Syria and Lebanon today. And the commentaries tell us that they were enemies, but they were not an immediate danger, but they were antagonists. They were always causing trouble. So King David says, I'm literally going to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. I'm going to feed my nation because I'm going to take the spoils of war, plus I'll get rid of this enemy. But before he did that, he needed authorization. Authorization first, the Talmud tells us, from the generals. That means you can only go on an authorized war. You can only start this type of war if you know for sure that you are going to win. And that is determined by generals. Then he had to go to the rabbinic court to get authorization from the high Supreme Court of 71 rabbis. The question is, did he have to ask permission? Did they have to approve it? Or they had to pray for them? That's for another discussion. And lastly, he had to get the blessings of the high priest, which was a form of prophecy, which they had to ask the high priest, who asked God through the breastplate. So you again find very few of these wars, and thereby King David, it is justified because they were antagonists, they were enemies, although not threatening at that moment. But David had the right and to benefit from the spoils. So let me conclude and then we'll get to questions. We are all waiting for the time that Isaiah promised us, that's written on the wall of the UN, which they don't live up to, that it will come a day that we will beat our swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not take up sword against nation, for they will know no war anymore. That is the ideal. Are we ready for it? Not so sure, but that's the ideal.
The Rohr Jewish Learning Institute has the largest collection of Jewish media online. Hit subscribe for more.